what I'll be trying to the story I will be trying to briefly tell you today is trying to frame a little bit why and within which context the CCA started to use actually cinema, I would say around 10 years ago, as a kind of a form of research, and display of content, integrating our, more traditional, I would say, curatorial strategies. To do that, I think I would love just to briefly introduce what the CCA is for, the audience who's maybe not familiar with this institution. So the CCA is a kind of so the Canadian Centre for Architecture is established here in Montreal, where I'm now in my office here, and has been founded by Phyllis Lambert in 1979, really as a kind of a hybrid institution meant to be exploring the relationship between the built environment and society, and really trying to understand in some cases how architecture can be a tool to kind of discover and really understand how society is evolving, and then the reverse, studying societal and sociopolitical transformation to really investigate what is the space which is surrounding us. This is our building in downtown Montreal, and it's, of course, is where, the exhibitions are happening, but also where mostly of our collection is located and stored. I was saying it's a sort of a kind of a hybrid institution in the sense that is really combining, the logic of a museum, so a sort of a kind of a, center with a large collection, and then an exhibition space, but also a research center where scholars and, researchers and students can come visit and, engage in various activities with what we do. The collection is actually, it's a very large collection. I'm not going to step into the details here now, but goes, from documents that initially have been acquired, moving from the Renaissance to more contemporary practices. Here are two examples. So the idea of kind of documents related to, the making of architecture, and then also an idea of unstable architecture, for example, with, the archive of and the work of Cedric Price, which is stored in our collection. But we like to say that we actually are interested more in collecting processes and ideas, more than, simply documents, archives, and actually objects or items or drawings and materials, to the level that we always say that we prefer not to even acquire, when we discuss with architects potential donation, the final or, the display models that have been presented for a competition or something, but we are more interested in all the steps that have been generating the project since the beginning. So this is just two quick examples of what we mean for processual kind of a material. For example, this is a copy of When Democracy Builds by Frank Lloyd Wright that we have in our collection. But it's interesting because we really kind of managed to get a copy where actually the architect decided to actually comment on a recently published edition of his work directly on the book, and then asking for the book to be reprinted after all these comments. But for us, it was very interesting to see how the architect was reflecting on his own work. Or, going back to, to the, some of the key figures of modern times, some cards kind of left by Le Corbusier to different kind of clients, annotating and suggesting how to imagine to treat different surfaces and interior spaces of their apartment. So this idea of a kind of an informal conversation with notes, annotation about something that is more, seems very distant from the large kind of a, documentation of the historic project of an architect. We like to say that, the institution is against a sort of an idea of monography, in the sense that since 15 years ago, the institution has decided to focus on thematic kind of forms of research. So here is a sort of an array of different fragments and documents and, parts of our, thematic investigation of the last 15 years, which are moving from studies of, indigenous sovereignty and relationship with land-based practices, environmentalism, the notion of crisis, relation between, body and space, different forms of migration. This is a again, to go deeper a little bit in this kind of aspect of our way of thinking, this is a slide of a PowerPoint produced in 2016 when the CCA was redesigning its own website. And so the way to organize the website, there is also a way to mirror our activity, was really to kind of try to cluster teams, ideas, and trying to understand how these different narratives could have been connected each other, producing, you know, research. They were producing exhibitions, they were producing maybe some research on the collection, and then each research was producing another forms of engagement, maybe with an architectural practice, it was donating then the archive to us, triggering other research. And so, you know, constructing something that to me is a sort of an organic tree of an institution which is moving on as a thinker, as a researcher. And then, for example, here giving kind of a shape to a website which is really a sort of a kind of a mirroring this type of idea. The exhibition for us, and I'm getting closer than to cinema, is really never sort of a stable or, you know, defined environment, but actually most of the time is a production site, is where our viewers are kind of coming to experience a sort of a kind of a display on the move, or an environment where actually we stage conversation, dialogues, you know, we trigger teams, we trigger our audience into, you know, with different questions which are trying to destabilize a sort of a reading of what architecture means today. Or we present material as, you know, using the metaphor of the lab in a form which is really the one of analytically trying to display aspect and connecting objects apparently not in relationship to the other. But then, as I said, together with this thematic sort of a form of exploration 15 years ago, also the institution kind of moved towards a specific kind of a focus, which was already clear, you know, in the previous kind of years since its kind of a foundation, but become more and more explicit. So all these texts you find in my slides, they are having, you know, just to explain, are written with the I voice, the I kind of a single, you know, person, because they are, you know, extracted by a publication that we developed in 2019 titled "The Museum is Not Enough," where actually we presented the work of the CCA using an I voice because we imagine, you know, the museum talking. So that's why the I. And, you know, we really trust the fact that the institution is really producing content through a process of collective thinking. And so we use somehow the I voice, so the museum is talking, but actually it's the collective, you know, curatorial team who's talking behind them. So there is this key kind of a definition of what we define, you know, this idea that the institution is focused on gray areas. And for us, gray areas are basically two potential kind of a meaning or nuances of meaning embedded into this definition. Gray areas, it means that the CCA has been always interested in exploring sites of frictions, also crisis and transformation, as the revelatory zones or sites where it's possible to understand how things are evolving. And so never kind of having, you know, the ambition on focusing on a sort of trying to a sort of a global mandate mapping what is happening in the world, but really following this idea of transformation as a kind of a key ones in also defining our international collection. But then gray areas for us are also, you know, basically the zones in between, those which are trying to really make you able to understand what is happening behind the scenes of a project. So, you know, which are the forces which are shaping architecture? What is happening in the back of a production of the built environment? So 10 years ago, we started really realizing how, you know, to explore this notion of something which is actually critical, under transformation, but at the same time, a sort of a gray zone behind the scene of something. Cinema could have been and should have been maybe the most suitable kind of a tool to do that. So I'm just kind of, you know, included here in this presentation a set of cinematographic projects we developed throughout the years, deliberately not in a chronological order, because I think that it's interesting to see how we approach, you know, things in different ways. This is I'm going to present you briefly a trilogy of films directed by Daniel Schwartz and curated by our director Giovanna Borasi on relationship between architectural kind of thinking and societal transformations, focusing specifically on three societal groups for which architecture we felt was kind of a struggling to be able to design a space or understand in which way, you know, in socio-political sense, architecture was able to kind of contribute to a discourse. So this is what it takes to make a home, a film, you know, conceived to study actually homelessness, so unhoused citizens between Los Angeles and Vienna. The notion of the singleton, so people living alone, you know, which is, of course, one of the trends of the last kind of 15 years. The more kind of, in a way, actually, family groups are defined as individuals. And this is a film, again, that has been shot mostly in Japan with the dialogues between architecture, kind of practices developing houses for, you know, individuals and anthropologists. And then the last of the series on the elderly. So a shot between Baltimore and Barcelona, really kind of in dialogue with developers who actually are, you know, thinking of different models of architecture for the elderly and, you know, typologies of pilot projects in Barcelona were also, you know, the mayor of the city and different forms of developers, they have been really kind of thinking of different forms of design for this specific societal group. Sometimes to really understand what architecture is, we realize that we have really to go very far away from it. In 2019, after kind of, you know, 10 years after the 2008, so the kind of explosion of this global financial crisis, which has undermined many of kind of in the Western kind of world, many of the undermining of the kind of established, you know, conviction in what was actually our world, financially, economically, and socially. We decided to explore critically what, you know, at the time was the political level, what was defined the ideology of happiness. So this sort of obsessive tensions toward well-being, also as a way to kind of hide, you know, a sort of the neoliberal agenda from the political perspective. And this is a film that we have been shooting in Omaha, Nebraska, in the call center, where the data for the famous World Happiness Indexes and all this rhetoric around the idea of happiness was basically the data were retrieved and produced for the indexes. And this is the project we have been mentioned, I've been mentioned at the beginning, in Lebanon, in Tripoli, with the artist Joyce Juma, trying to investigate and, you know, Lebanon from a kind of a, you know, and Tripoli in itself from a kind of a wider perspective, using as a case study actually the story of the Oscar Niemeyer abandoned fair trade building in the core of the city. Again, exploring with two different type of, you know, also lenses, through also through the gaze of an artist as Joyce Juma, you know, the site in itself, the architecture in itself, the sort of a kind of a very emblematic and significant and full of kind of stories, architecture of Oscar Niemeyer and this sort of a modern failure. Also, you know, with the narrative which was surrounding the site. So for us, it was very interesting kind of to explore how Joyce Juma has been basically investigating the edge, the margins of a critical site to understand, you know, a story connected to socio-political crisis. Or, you know, an installation cinematographic project with indigenous performers, Takalik Patridge, Lakalok Williams, Batory, meant to be a sort of an investigation of how space making practices in the global north are, you know, tools for defining indigenous sovereignty. I'm going to conclude with actually a specific story which is now in our galleries at the CCA so far. Please tell me if I'm going too long, so that I will try
maybe
to.
one more minute.
Okay, so it's a story that I will keep 2 minutes and I will try to be very short. It's a story of the series kind of a groundwork, which is a sort of a kind of a next step in our conceptualization of what cinema means. We have been developing a lot of kind of exhibitions and projects with contemporary practices today. but always somehow inviting the architects, you know, here in Montreal and developing dialogues here. We decided to reverse our logic and meet, you know, three contemporary practices which are investigating today new methodological approach to what it means building in the age of ecological crisis on the ground. So we decided to meet after almost kind of 2 years of studio visits, three offices which we thought they are posing nowadays interesting questions about, you know, what it means subvert a certain logic of approaches to the built environment. We encountered them on the ground. We decided kind of to shoot 3 documentaries during the phases of making some of their projects. So we selected Shu Tiantian, who has been developing, you know, in the past years and now also nowadays a lot of project in the rural. And this specific kind of a project we selected on Meju Island, a small island between Taiwan and China, where she's basically has been asked to build a large museum on a sort of a very interesting ecological, religious kind of a site in the island in China. And she decided to reverse the brief and decided of not building any building, but find forms of engagement with the communities to transform her architectural project in a display of marine agriculture on the island. The second film is now in our galleries, To Build Low, Construire des Lois, where we have been following for 1 year the Office B+, which is developing not an architectural project, but actually a political campaign to discourage and to kind of actually try to transform laws at the European level to discourage, you know, demolition and speculation connected to real estate and, you know, encourage and boost the idea of renovation as the new norm.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this conference and gathering. Yeah, and you know, reading the sort of thematics of the talk, so you've put together, it's really intriguing, and I consider myself very privileged to be part of the discussion. So on the invitation to sort of focus on a conversation about cinema, I wanted to present on my work on tropical modernism that's been part of exhibitions at the V&A in London and also at the Venice Biennale, the 18th Architecture Venice Biennale. So my talk this afternoon, very briefly, is titled Cinema and Music in West African Architectural Modernism. And as introduced, I'm an architect, a lecturer, a researcher, a writer and speaker. I do a multitude of things in my practice because I think that architecture has the ability to communicate across different mediums and offer different kinds of critical reflections through, whether it's through building architecture itself or making architecture itself or writing and speaking about architecture. So my practice is quite broad and varied in what we do. As mentioned, I run an architecture office called YAA Projects, and the office, again, operates on a range of kind of scales and through different mediums. So we've designed and curate exhibitions, we've done a few interiors, some public projects, and also moving into larger sort of city-based projects. Today, I'm going to be focusing on my talk on this particular project, which is Tropical Modernism, Architecture and Power in West Africa, which was first shown at the V&A Applied Arts Pavilion at the 18th International Architecture Exhibition in Venice. And then last year was followed by an exhibition on Tropical Modernism, Architecture and Independence at the V&A in London. So I decided to sort of split my presentation into 2 parts. The first focusing on cinema and music as an archive, specifically focused on Ghanaian modernism and its development. And the next part looking at filmmaking as a curatorial practice. And this work is centered on a film that I co-directed and produced, also called Tropical Modernism, Architecture and Power. That film is a 30-minute long feature film that's been shown as part of these exhibitions I mentioned earlier, and a small segment of it is available, a 10-minute segment of it is available on YouTube. So after this talk, I'll put in the chat if anyone wants to access that and watch that. So as I mentioned, the first part of this talk is going to focus, oh, sorry, I just need to move. Yeah. The first part of this talk is going to focus on cinema and music as an archive. So when we think about the archive, we're usually confronted with images like this. So images of documents, newspapers, cuttings, images that sort of sit in libraries in physical space and have a sort of physicality to them. And one of the, in making this exhibition, of course, we consulted kind of traditional archives. So this image comes from the George Padmore Library, and it's a newspaper article from Tuesday, 21st of May, 1963, which talks about, and the cover story is, this is the new Ghana Nkrumah's building, and it celebrates the kind of promise of architecture for Ghana that instituted under Kwame Nkrumah, and how he saw modernism as part of a kind of language of independence and really Black power in independent West Africa. But aside from that, we also, in making this exhibition and thinking about the archive and the practice of exhibition making, I think had to consider more widely what the archive itself is, especially in non-Western contexts where other forms of visual communication become very powerful tools of communicating. And so, images like this from James Barner were also included in the exhibition, thinking about the sort of relationship between architecture and culture of the kind of 1950s and independence era in West Africa. But something that really also struck me in putting together that exhibition was how much music was also, music and cinema were also focal points to think about as archives and to think about what the stories they told about that particular moment in history, and how architecture was conceived as part of a sort of visual culture. So this selection of vinyl covers is by all music selections from E.T. Mensah, who was a Ghanaian musician operating a kind of early about the 30s onwards. And E.T. Mensah was a kind of figure of in kind of contemporary, I'd say, music of the kind of 50s and in kind of recording in the independence era. And one of his most sort of famous songs is Ghana Freedom, which we is used to backtrack our, it's a soundtrack to the film that we made. But for me, these selection of these kind of vinyl covers of this project with this Tempos band really reveal how architecture was sort of instrumentalized as part of a kind of visual record. And looking at these images, it's sort of really, they are, for me, archival works. They sort of present a moment in history, what architecture is doing, how it's being framed, and also really understood by the public, and how it's understood by citizens of a country, and what part of how architecture forms part of the kind of everyday. So for me, the sort of thinking about where we found information, what we considered archival was really, this was an opportunity to really broaden that. And I'm going to talk a bit about one particular song, and I have to say that this work is very much sort of indebted to Dele Adeyemo's research, actually, that he did with the CCA, looking at Tema Newtown and its development, thinking about music as an archive. And I was very fortunate to be in conversation with Dele as part of the V&A's Friday Lates program, where our film was shown, and he was talking about this this particular record by a Ghanaian band called Wollomi. And the song, sort of, there's a particular song which talks about and records through music and high life the sort of tale of this museum, this hotel. So this is a Meridian Hotel in Tema, which was a kind of modernist sort of sort of masterpiece, a jewel in sort of the redevelopment of Tema Newtown as a new port city, a new modernist port city. This structure still stands. It's still in a kind of quite dilapidated state, but it's a, you know, sort of this grand piece of architecture overlooking the sort of coastline of Ghana and onto the Atlantic. And it sort of was you know, it was very much a sort of an epitome of kind of Ghanaian modernism at the time. And through Dele's research, he uncovers this song by Woolemi, which talks about how high life music specifically forms part of the archive of these buildings. So in this song, the history of the sort of social history, I'd say, not the kind of maybe sort of drawn physical history, but the social history of this building is recorded in kind of music of the time. And it talks about, I won't read the lyrics word for word, but it talks about, you know, two young people sort of having a night out in the Meridian Hotel in Tema. They're going to dine, they're going to drink, they're going to dance. And you kind of sort of music like this and thinking about music and as part of an archival culture that helps us understand a kind of period of modernism sort of reminds us of also the kind of cultural significance of these buildings. So they're big political important projects, but they also become the kind of backdrop of everyday life for people. I think it was very much understood by a kind of crop of independence leaders what the culture of music and cinema, how that could propel the sort of story, the narrative of independence forward. So this is an image of the Uhuru Band, who often accompanied Nkrumah, and here their dress is particularly is important. They're dressed in traditional Fugu attire. They're celebrating a kind of proud nation. The name Uhuru it's not it's a Swahili word, I believe. There's a sort of Pan-Africanism sort of celebrated as part of music and its culture, and how it sort of stood side by side with a kind of modernist movement. And then also thinking about, I wanted to extend cinema and music to kind of theatre. And I think that in Ghanaian culture, especially, sort of small form theatre performance is very much rooted in the culture. So thinking about kind of maybe rural life where, you know, the sort of compound in the middle of a kind of cluster of houses was a real place for kind of gathering and sort of just sharing stories, the sort of idea of performance and music, and making that space a kind of forum for sharing ideas was a really important one. So for me, it's really interesting to see how theatre kind of costume, kind of sort of stage building was also instrumentalized as part of the way to get across these sort of big architectural ideas, architectural projects to the kind of everyday citizen. So thinking about these floats that were captured by Michael Hurst, looking at you know, the development of Tema and really presenting that in a quite public way, and how cinema, theatre, music all sort of form part of that tool to do that. And thinking about images like this, where, you know, grand projects like the Volta River project were toured across the country using models, using theatre to really kind of get the buy-in of everyday people. And then just to move on to the second part of my talk, we'll be looking at the film that we made as part of the exhibitions I've talked about. So the films were co-produced and co-directed by me in collaboration with Bushra Mohammed and Christopher Turner. So just to kind of preface this, the film set as part of this exhibition, firstly shown in Venice. Chris and I spent 2.5 weeks with the production crew in Ghana, working on gathering footage extensively of these films, and recorded about 16 surviving buildings from the kind of tropical modernist period, and interviewed about 12 different key protagonists of that period to really sort of make this film. And for me, it was really interesting to work with film as part of a kind of curatorial practice and storytelling, and what it means to bring something to an audience. And for me, that was one of the most enjoyable parts of the production of the exhibition, but also actually the exhibition itself, because I think, the photography, the bringing out archival information and showing it is one way to kind of celebrate these stories, but there's something much more immersive about a film that allows people to be immersed in the topic and the subject, and choosing to do that in 3 screens was also part of this idea of this kind of immersive experience of these buildings in this time. So there you see. This is Wesley Girls' School, and we were really lucky to be there on the eve of an important celebration day for them. So you can see how these buildings are dressed, how they come alive, and a kind of record of this now exists with people in it, with how the buildings are used now. And these 3 images might appear quite random, actually, but for me, when we started thinking about this film project as part of the exhibition, these were 3 really important references for me. And I really enjoyed them as references because they're very much part of a kind of popular culture. Well, maybe Adam Curtis, maybe more so of a kind of architectural, deep documentary maker, but certainly references from Burna Boy's African Giant or Half a Yellow Sun are much more part of a kind of everyday cultural register. So the image on the left is a still from Adam Curtis's film Black Power, which I'd really encourage you all to watch if you haven't. The second is in the middle is a still from B. Balande's film adaptation of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's book, Half of a Yellow Sun. And the last is the cover from African Giant by Burna Boy. And I include that one specifically to a song that it's the interlude to a song with Manifest. And it talks specifically about Unilever's relationship with Nigeria as a country. And for me, these kind of registers are all really important documents of nation building, of the story of independence told through very different mediums, from the very sort of documentary making to a kind of 30-second clip in a popular music song that might spur on somebody to try and know more about the kind of relationship of countries' independence and colonization. Just wrapping up. And for me, what was really enjoyable about this is, exhibitions are like this especially presents quite a lot of information, but there are moments like this that allow an audience to sort of sit still and really kind of immerse themselves in what's being presented at their own pace, watching this a film like this. The other thing that was really important to me, also as a Ghanaian, a person of Ghanaian heritage, was that for me, this work, making this exhibition, was both kind of a professional triumph as well as something deeply personal. It's about my history, it's about my home country, and it's about, really key people like the architect Joe Durban, who's an architectural historian, and on the right, Professor Henry Wellington, who are really key figures in telling the story about Ghanaian modernism, but often aren't sort of highlighted and spotlighted. And for me to be able to interview them and talk to them as part of the production of this film was really something really special. And I think for me, the film serves as an ongoing record, an ongoing archive that continues to enrich the story of Ghanaian modernism. And also, it's important to also talk about the personal stories of these really important figures. So this is a widow of Samuel Larbi, Mrs. Patience Larbi, who Samuel Larbi was a really important Ghanaian modernist architect who trained at the Architectural Association. And listening to his wife talk about the time they spent in London while he was studying and she was working at the University of London really sort of brings to fore the sort of stories you're telling and the kind of personal narratives that sit behind these stories. Or, sort of celebrating the work and documenting people like John Owusu-Ada, a really important Ghanaian architectural figure. When we made this film, he was 95, and for me, it's such a joy to be able to include his reflections on this time period in a film like this, which goes on to live in the archive. And I just wanted to conclude with some reflections on what the archive is. For a while, I also teach at the Architectural Association, and for the last couple of years, we've been looking at the archive as a kind of architectural project. And last year, we looked at the archive as a kind of in the domestic. This year, we're looking at the archive in the kind of as the built environments and archive. But I always kind of think about what the archive is, and when doing so, always come back to Stuart Hall's work, especially his essay, Constituting an Archive. And these two quotes are just quickly pulled out from there and things I'd like to end on. So to think about the archive is really constituting an archive represents significant moments on which we need to reflect on with care. And I think about that in relation to putting together a film, what it means in terms of the history of film, music, and theatre, and what our film maybe adds to the archive, and how to do that with care. And then what a living archive is, and how that is maybe differs from the kind of traditional archive. The living archive is present, it's ongoing, it's continuing, it's unfinished, it's open-ended. And I think that film really encompasses that sort of open-endedness, that sort of storytelling that is generous because it allows for more to come of it. So perhaps I'll leave it there, and I look forward to being in conversation after the last presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I would like to say a couple of words before the film runs. I suppose Mai will run it. Thank you very much for having me in this. I'm really enjoying this day, meeting new people and learning a lot. This film is part of a trilogy. The other two films will be shown. They are screened actually, and you have the password to get to those films. This one that we will see now is on Beirut. The other two are on Cairo and Rabat. And hopefully we will do more with Sharjah on cities all over the Arab world. Of course, the theme is a journey into architecture archives. I think I can speak later about the process and the connection of these films to the exhibition that I curated for the Sharjah Architecture Triennial. I have a few slides. But first, let's see this film. So maybe we can run it.
The association is called Markaz Al-Arabi Lil-Amara, the Arab Center for Architecture, founded in 2008 in Beirut. The idea is to initiate research, develop the cultural value of architecture, to make it a platform to discuss the issues of the built environment. It is not about the buildings only, it's about the people. It's bettering the lives of people. And understanding issues of history, issues of modernity, are very important to construe a contemporary image of ourselves. But also, it is important to learn from precedents and lessons and not fetishize architecture styles.
هدول حطيتوهم مثل ما حكينا فواتير لواحد ومراسلات لواحد.
هدول كمان
هدول تبع جهشين هذا سامي العواني اوكي دبيس كهرباء تجارة سويدية هذا كان على ساحة النجمة كل وثائق تبعه والأرشيف تبعه زيز اللي عملوه أجاكس من أول أيام الألمنيوم أوائل راحت هبطت عادت موجودة هدول ايه؟ تمام
صاروا ولا ايه؟
صاروا هيدا الصالة هيدا المبنى السكني
هذا كمان مبنى لأنه 121
المبنى هون اوكي السينما هون لانه فوق السينما كان ممنوع يعمروا كانوا يعمروا على الشارع والسينما ببيحة ورا البناية هيدا طلب الرخصة هون مبينة خريطة الأرض هيدي اللي السبينز الأولاني وهيدي البناية اللي ورا هلا محجور هون عاملين حساب انه بدهم يعملوا البنايه بعدين والدليل هون هذه شكل الارض انتم ما بتتذكروا جيلكم بس هون كان في محطه بنزين مبرونه وهيدا السوبر ماركت هيدا كان في من اول اسكاليترز هيدا الاسكاليتر
أعتقد مواصفاته كمان
تمام هم خليهم سوا لانه وصلوا سوا يعني هيدي الرسمه مع المكتوب
هيدا اللي تنفذ الاسكليتر
هيدا اللي تنفذ هذا بيت المختلف اللبناني بال 64 بيير نعمة جاك عرقتنجي جون نويل كونون جوزيف نصار كان اسمهم سيتا جروب لسوء الحظ هيدا تشوه تغيرت مع علمه بس هاي الخريطة بتفرجينا على المضبوط شو كان المقصود هيدول قناطر بس مش قناطر كاملة حاولوا يوحوا بالطابع اللبناني بس عملوا مبنى حديث وجهاته كلها ازاز ومفتوح على البحر هلا اذا مرقتوا قدامه يمكن ما تعرفوا
Je commençais mon cours d'architecture par une phrase très célèbre que beaucoup d'élèves de mes collègues doivent se souvenir maintenant. Je leur disais, connaissez-vous une seule université au monde qui vous donne des PhD, des diplômes en poésie? Qu'est-ce que c'est l'architecture? C'est pas écrire un immense poème en 3 dimensions, en 4 dimensions. C'est une vraie poésie. C'est vraiment de l'art.
المشاريع المهمة لحتى واحد ما يتأثر بالتاني إن كل مين يعمل سكتشز لوحد وبعدين نجتمع سوا ونشوف كيف نوحد بين النقط المهمة ميكانيكال انجينير ورينفورس كونكريت انجينير نشوف على سكتش شو هو الانبوت تبعه.
لما انت بلشت كنت تقولوا هدول اللي قبلكم مين اللي؟
أشهر الموجودين كان أنطوان تابي وفريد الثلاث وبعد عبد النور.
ايه
يقولون دايركت سيمين.
شو في مشاريع كمان كانت تتميز برأيك؟
كمان تبع صيدا.
لما جينا نحن من هون بس عم نحكي ست الخمسينات دور المهندس المعماري كان ما وارد نحن بيعرف شو دوره. كان في انجينير باتيسور فهون الصقل الهندسه المعماريه اجت من هالاشخاص حقيقه اللي راسا خريجين بعد الحرب او اوائل الحرب فكلهم من نفس العجينه.
هذا أي بروجي؟ بعدنا نجار بيلدينج راس بيروت. اوكي العقار 633 فينا نشوف بخريطة بيروت 633 راس بيروت وين هو؟ لا نشوف شو بيقولوا هون. حمام طابق السابع مرخص تحت كذا وبناء غرف غسيل وغرفة مكانات مصعد وبيت درج وخزان مياه في الطابق الثامن. يعني هدول عم يشتغلوا هون رينوفيشن على البناية. يمكن مش هن مضيوها شاير أديب، إجا حدا عامل تعديلات عليها.
مش الأسد وراه في
شوفي في سبيس بين الأسد وهذا في سبيس.
ايه
بالسكشن في زحام.
ايه
زحام كأنه
في شيء
بدك تقشعي بين اثنين بين هيدا وهيدا في شيء ببين منه مبين عم بتطلع للآخر أنا إذا في شيء ما في شيء. يمكن هو
يمكن ايه هول لأنه هيك
شو هي؟
هذا ستيرز بعدك عم تطلع
بعدنا عم نطلع
طلعنا كم ستيرز بعدين في لاندينج and then you go
وهذيك جوا.
ايه
اوكي ترك لنا لغز فرانك لويد. In this book on modernism, there is this building in Beirut, the Maqdisi building, the mid-50s. You can see the pilotis on the ground floor, the sunscreens, the opening to the sky, the caps. It's quite representative of that elegant architecture of the mid-50s. It's a book about the Arab world, modernism in the Arab world, designing modernity. And we took 10 case studies. It's in English and in Arabic. This book is by Rahif Fayyad. It is an account of the reconstruction and the matter of public sphere and architecture في العمارة والشأن العام. Public space and so on.
Donc ça c'est un magazine d'architecture qui a été publié
C'est le magazine de l'ordre des ingénieurs et architectes.
Et il existe toujours.
Oui, mais sous une autre forme. Il a pris un autre format.
Okay.
C'était pratiquement la seule publication d'architecture. Ces documents-là sont devenus en fait des archives. Et voilà, on va peut-être arriver, on est en 67. Vous me dites, il est sur la couverture.
Et
68, le voici.
Ouais.
Lisez.
Une musique douce mènera le piéton à travers toutes les ruelles. Une grande pâtisserie permettra la détente avant ou après la projection d'un film dans une salle de cinéma placée à partir du premier étage. Cette salle de cinéma en forme de coquille, reposant si légèrement sur des rotules, malgré l'ampleur de son volume, permettra de vivre à chaque début de projection et pendant quelques secondes un voyage dans l'espace de par une synchronisation d'un son et d'un jeu de lumière étudié.
Le plan, ici on voit le souk en bas. La salle, c'est une photo, c'est un plan coupé pris au niveau de l'escalier. Donc on voit l'escalier qui est au milieu de la salle. On voit la double coque ici. Le centre commercial au rez-de-chaussée. Les immeubles prévus. Donc celui-ci était construit puis démoli. Celui-là n'a jamais été construit. Ici, dans cette façade, on voit que, d'ailleurs, c'est écrit ici, c'est que ça, c'est réel mawjoud, donc inexistant. Hein? Donc ça, c'est un dessin fait par la suite qui explique qu'ils n'ont plus construit cette partie-là. On ne le voit pas malheureusement dans cette photo, mais on le connaît derrière le centre Azarié de Lecomte. Le centre de Azarié de Lecomte, qui est d'ailleurs, c'est le même architecte qui a construit Azarié, qui est cette école et ce couvent qui sont là en face de nous. C'est le même architecte. C'est mon architecte qui a beaucoup construit à Beirut, l'hôpital Rezé. Il a construit les deux Azari. Il a construit l'ancien aéroport avec Vicario. Et ces archives ont été trouvées dans une benne à ordures à Paris, imaginez-vous. Les archives de Lecomte.
Qu'est-ce que c'est que cette histoire?
Oui.
Non, mais il faut raconter.
Mais je vous assure, les archives de Lecomte ont été trouvées dans une benne à ordures. Quelqu'un vidait un bureau depuis quelques années. Quelqu'un vidait un bureau et puis par la suite quelqu'un appelle l'IFA, l'Institut français d'architecture, pour leur dire que les gens ramassaient dans une benne à ordures des photos d'architecture et des plans. Ils ont accouru, ils ont trouvé que c'était les archives Lecomte. Bon, des photos avaient disparu, mais la plupart des plans étaient toujours là. Et j'ai une correspondance avec le directeur de l'IFA, dans laquelle il m'explique, parce que je lui ai demandé s'ils avaient les plans de cette école et d'autres archives de Lecomte. Il m'explique qu'elles avaient été trouvées dans une benne. Et nous espérons avoir une copie bientôt. Et cette école est assez extraordinaire parce que c'est une œuvre urbaine dans le quartier ici. Nous sommes très heureux d'être en face. Il y a des cours intérieurs à l'intérieur, il y a un espace très moderne à l'intérieur, et de l'extérieur, il y a cette sorte d'austérité du travail de la pierre, très bon travail de la pierre d'ailleurs. Et là, en face, vous voyez les enfants à travers la vitre. Donc c'est une sorte d'espace où on fait du sport. Et au milieu, vous avez le château d'eau, qui est là depuis les années 30, donc bien avant l'école construite début des années 50.
نجيب اللون تبع هيدا البروبرتي
ليرز موجودين على ارض البور يكونوا موجودين على هيدي كمان ساعتها ما بديها فكره الاحمر كمان شلون يعني نحن نكفي لونز دوبل هيك وبتفتح بلا ما نحدد وين بتسكر يعني بتبلش من هون وبتفتح هيك لبرا حتى كنا باخر شيء كمان بس هاي البارتي
كيفك منيح؟ كيفك انت جورج؟ منيح تمام. قبل كل شيء بدي اقول لك انه الخرايط اللي جمعناهم من عندكم تبع جورج ريس في بيناتهم خرايط بناية عريضة. هدول طلبوهم مديرية الآثار اعطيناهم نسخة كرمال يحافظوا على البناية لأنه بتعرفي مهددة بالهدم وأكيد لازم يتحافظ عليها.
So this is our space, and the film you saw on Beirut, because we shot it inside the space itself, because I didn't want to play that I was visiting the city that I know very well. So we did everything inside, but the glass, which is our sort of picture window here, becomes a sort of palimpsest, and the archives appear on the glass, and you see the city through its archives to understand it better. So that was the idea of this film. And as I mentioned, it was part of a larger project. It's a trilogy, which is an exhibition. I was commissioned by the Sharjah Architecture Triennial to curate it. And I decided to take 3 cities, Cairo, Beirut, and Rabat. And this is the opening of the exhibition in Sharjah. This is one of the rooms where I explained what our archives asked to perform, because I think archives are a sort of living organism with the interpretations that are related to the time when you look at these archives and what you do with them. So I explain here what can archives perform. These are shots from the exhibition. And in the other room, which was a beautiful high ceiling room and large room, I exhibited models of either aborted or unbuilt designs from the 3 institutions, plus the model of Frank Lloyd Wright's unbuilt project for a museum in Baghdad. This was the sort of layout with the interior facades. This is a project in Morocco, and the films were actually part of the exhibition, and they were flat. The screens were flat with the drawings. So you have a sort of animated archive, animated drawing. And the models, I didn't want to use digital reproductions of projects, 3D animations and so on. So they are physical models to reinstate the physicality of architecture and the tactility of architecture. So this is a model of an aborted project by Hassan Fathi, New Paris. And here you can remove the ceiling and you can see what's happening in the courtyard. This is also a nice device whereby I reproduced the idea of the perspective of starting from the Renaissance with a horizon line and so on. So there was a cone that was hanging from the ceiling, and one could, and this is for the kids so that kids can go as high as the cone to really see from this 1.5 meter level. That is the actual level of the whole exhibition. And this is a short film that explains how it works. So through this, you can see a plan that is printed on glass, and through the plan, you can see the model that is beyond, and everything concords together.